Dr. Jennifer Ball is the Associate Professor of History and Social Documentation and the Chief Inclusion Officer at Clarkson University.
Me, personally, I have to fight for everybody's rights.
She does this by studying and helping folks understand her findings involving gender and sexuality, something she says is easier than we give it credit for.
These kind of simple things to it, because I think that's one of the things people are like, it's this big thing. And I'm like, no, it's smaller things. It can have really big impacts on your life because they're the building blocks of what we think we are. But it also doesn't have to be a huge fight. You know, you can think this is going to change your identity in horrible ways or like really dramatic ways. And it's like, we're always changing. You know, I'm not the same person I was when I was 5 years old.
Dr. Ball says that these studies are sometimes just reading between the lines.
What I realized was the stories that weren't getting told, right? And one of the things that I really love in history is the idea of listening to the silences. And if you've noticed the way people are talking about history today, this is a really important thing, right? Because for a very long time, we told only certain stories of history. And what started to happen was I realized that there were all these amazing dynamic stories that are sitting there.
She took us on a journey that we'll share with you over these next few minutes through the centuries, then decades of gender, sexuality, identity, and the LGBTQ+ community, starting with the beginning of our society and the simple yet complex idea of just what we consider masculine and feminine.
Look around you on any given day. There's so many men of so many different types of behaviors, so many women of so many different types of behaviors. And it was interesting to me, like, why did we only say this was ladylike or this was masculine? And what did that mean about how we built our societies? Especially because you look outside of your own society, you see so many variations on what people will say is masculine or feminine.
Dr. Ball started learning about this as she was growing up, thinking about people as a whole and their role in American history and its documents.
There were promises we could be all of that to everybody, right? And that's the way I grew up in the 70s with the bicentennial, is the idea that those promises of 1776 could be there for everybody. And that's what I kind of found fascinating in history, was that we could see people who had fought for civil rights for people. And, you know, you could see it in the Constitution, you could see it in the amendments, the Bill of Rights, and you could see the people who put those there, right? They didn't just appear. People had to fight for that. And so, you know, whether you're looking at women's suffrage, right? Whether you're looking at the first 10 amendments with, you know, important things like freedom of expression, or the 9th Amendment, which basically says if it didn't get given to small government or big government, it belongs to the citizen. You know, that stuff was really important. And things like how people were able to live their lives led to changes in that document.
That document, the Bill of Rights, a promise to all Americans and really the start of this conversation, perhaps before we may have even realized that it needed to be a conversation.
Say to people, how did we become the country we became? Who was involved in that? Who was denied, you know, inclusion in that? And how has that changed over time? And are we fulfilling the promises or not? And so that's what I really look at.
Something I don't think folks necessarily always realize is, for example, we do these specials on all sorts of different minority groups from, you know, probably our biggest one is Black History Month. And something I love to learn or realize is that Black people have always been part of our history here in the country. In the same way, gay people have always been part of our history here. Although I would say that significant changes in the gay community do seem to be more recent than any other minority group. What are those? Can you give us an overview of what are those changes and what has finally progressed them?
Yeah, I think what you really see is that, you know, you have a society, the U.S. society is based on basically opposite sex, marriage, nuclear family, right? When that's your basis, you have people who may have identified as same-sex attracted, but they knew they had to do certain things to be a part of society, right? or they may have lived on the fringes of society, and so they didn't have the rights and things like that. Or there may have been active laws against, right, these individuals, and that's another way that you find people existed. What happens is when people get to a place where they can independently survive, right? Well, then that gives you the space to create lives for yourself, right? That gives you the space to create communities.
These LGBTQ plus communities, as we call them now, beginning maybe earlier than you were thinking.
You look at the end of the 1800s, you know, people are starting to make more money for themselves. They don't necessarily have to live in households, right? Women are becoming educated, right? Men can be bachelors. And that starts to create communities as early as that time. Now, they existed before that, but ones that kind of continue to exist.
From the 1800s, jumping to the U.S. involvement in World War II in the 40s.
You get to World War II. World War II is a really important point because one of the things that people point out is that, you know, there's no higher service in our country than to, you know, your country as part of the armed forces, right? Well, gay individuals served.
Those American soldier individuals, gay American soldier individuals, getting home and realizing their rights they have fought for abroad needed a different type of fight back home.
You know, gay Americans were like, I fought for this country. I did, you know, I made some very serious sacrifices. Where are my rights? And so communities that had started to form started to really think about this. And so you see as early as the 50s, people saying, I deserve what everybody else has as an American citizen, and I'm going to fight for it. And so you see protests in front of Independence Hall, right? Very silent, very quiet protests. And then you see what happens. Like a lot of people talk about the 50s as like this kind of quiet moment. It wasn't. It's the beginning of the civil rights movement. It's the beginning of the peace movement. It's the beginning of women's rights movements in so many ways.
The groundwork late in the 50s, paving the way for a loud and proud decade of the 60s.
But what you see happen is in the late 60s and into the early 70s, those groups who were saying, I'm not going to be silent. I'm very proud of who I am as a person. My love is love, right? I get to be respected. And that in that moment, they say, I deserve to not get fired. I deserve to have a housing I can rely on. I deserve, you know, to have all the rights that other people have, certain protections. And so you start to see that fight really form.
And that's where the fight really began to form. Counter legislation proposed as well, but progress made. Then a setback no one saw coming.
In the 80s, this horrible moment of the earliest AIDS epidemic. It was misunderstood, it was mislabeled, it was called the gay men's disease.
In tragedy, like this one, where literally hundreds of thousands of people died. Something happens in history, though, as recently as after 9/11 or even this past year of COVID. People come together.
But it did a couple of things that people don't always recognize. It did unite a lot of LGBT community together because they realized people were not there for them. And so they had to be there for each other.
From that point of unity, progress is being made within the country again.
Really see from that period forward this constant kind of growth and effort on the part of LGBT individuals, but you also start to see very much allies too. And so what that did is you got through a cultural cycle, a generational cycle. Well, people were seeing individuals they knew, they loved, they recognized, and they were like, oh, this is not this bogeyman thing that had been created.
In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled same-sex couples the constitutional right to marry.
Our students, for example, at a university, they've never known a world where there wasn't same-sex marriage. We still have those cycles going on. We still have people who don't believe that it's appropriate or it's right for certain rights to be extended to the LGBT community, but you have much more cultural acceptance because of what people have done. That's what I refer to when I say people really fought for their civil rights.